Hello there. You're listening to 10 Questions, where we discuss the wet plate collodion process and the photographers that create these unique images known as ambrotypes and tintypes. I'm your host, Chad Shryock, wet plate photographer for Pork Pie Photography based in Fort Collins, Colorado. In each episode, I've asked a modern-day practitioner to sit down with me and talk about how they got involved with this vintage process, share some information on their gear and studio, and provide some valuable insights into their creative process. So whether you're just beginning to dabble your toes in the collodion ethers, or you're a seasoned silverbath expert, hang on and see what develops with 10 Questions. In this episode, we get to sit down with a fellow Hoosier and professional photographer that's been doing some incredible wet plate work over the last few years. With interests in Star Wars, guitars, and capturing images of our veterans, my next guest and I have a lot in common. Based in Santa Ana, California, I'd like to welcome Jon Haverstick to 10 Questions. Hey, Jon, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks, Chad. I've been listening to this podcast for the last couple seasons, and I'm honored to be included among some of your greats.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. I'm glad that we were finally able to connect, and glad to have you on the show.
Likewise. I know we've chatted a few times back and forth over social media, and it's nice to actually connect finally.
Exactly.
By voice.
Yeah, exactly, by voice. Yeah, like some of my other guests, you're not just a wet plate photographer, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
Okay. So
yeah.
let's see. You started in healthcare.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. Yeah, I started in healthcare as a genetic counselor right out of college.
Okay.
And did that for 11 or 12 years and moved from that into healthcare education. Worked for a company that developed online continuing education for doctors and nurses and dental health and home health professionals.
Okay.
And did that for about the same amount of time, about 11 or 12 years. And it was kind of at the top of where I could go in that last career. And in chatting with my wife, who knew that I was bored and with what I was doing, she said, well, what if you could do what you wanted to do, what would it be? And I said, well, I'd really love to do my photography full time.
Yeah.
And
okay.
So we took the leap, and it was just kind of stepping off the cliff at that point, because it wasn't, 1 foot in the full-time gig and 1 foot in the photography. It was just jump in.
Right,
so
right.
It's been going great for about the last 12 years.
So from the photographic aspect, I mean, you shoot a lot of portraits, you do corporate and commercial kind of brand photography.
Yeah.
I saw that you've got an FAA licensed drone operator ability.
Yeah, the 107
Yeah.
certificate, yeah.
And now you're into vintage photographic processes. So
Yeah.
what was really that motivation to get into photography to start with? How was that something you wanted to go back to?
Yeah. Well, I started in photography, back in the 70s. I guess I should clarify the 1970s. I'm in high school, and, as a freshman, got started right off the bat with the yearbook and newspaper, and found that, having a camera at that time, this was, of course, before digital and before everybody had a phone in their pocket, that, being able to actually create an image with a manual camera, having to understand exposure and composition and all of that, gave me a skill that other folks didn't have, and it gave me access and some opportunity that I wouldn't have had otherwise. And so that was interesting to me at first, but the more I did it, the more I found that what was most interesting to me was photographing people, and having the opportunity to talk to people, to find out more about their stories, and spending a little time with them, just kind of getting to know them and creating images together. Of all the different types of photography that I could do, that was the thing that really, really stuck with me, the thing I kept coming back to. And it's just persisted, from that time until, again, started doing it full time just 12 years ago, but it's something I've done ever since. And it's always been a part of me. I made the jump to digital, I think, in about 2005 or so. And then in the last probably 5 or 6 years or so, have moved back to film for all of my personal work. All my commercial work still digital, of course, that's
Sure.
what the client expects.
Yep.
but all of my personal work had moved back to film, medium and large format primarily. And I've always been fascinated in the wet plate process. Didn't know a whole lot about it, but always been fascinated by it. And then I realized after a time, it's actually during COVID, that I kind of had most of the stuff that I needed to try it. And COVID gave me an opportunity to learn more about it and to get my feet wet and my fingertips stained, and it kind of went from there.
Right, right. So whenever you opened up your photography business, kind of in the late 2010, 2011 timeframe or so, something like that.
Out there. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What's it like trying to start up a new photography business in California during that time?
One of the best things that I did when I first opened my doors was got involved with a business networking group right away. I'd tried, Chamber of Commerce and some other things, and I was invited to a BNI meeting. Are you familiar with BNI? Have you heard of it?
I have not, no.
Yeah. It's been around for about 35 years. It's an international business networking organization. But I went to a meeting and I realized that, this is what I need to get started. There were people who had been in business longer than me, different types of businesses. I was the only photographer in the group, but people that I could look up to as sort of business mentors. And for me, that was what I really needed to get started. Because, like most people who start a business, doing something they're passionate about, like photography or, whatever it happens to be, they do it because they're really passionate. They're really good at what they do, but they're not necessarily great business people. So
point.
having business people around me that could kind of, answer questions and be there to help as I needed help and direction and guidance and things made a huge difference for me. And not that it hasn't been up and down, since then, but more or less the road has been, a good one since that time. And I think that's due in large part to the folks that I've been able to connect with and to learn from. And there's no lack of opportunity here in Southern California. There's a zillion photographers, but there's also a zillion opportunities. So I'm not really concerned about that so much. But having good people around me has been a huge, huge help.
Yeah, that's great. That's good to have that inspiration. I mean, you kind of mentioned that people get passionate about something and they think that they can operate a business just from that, but there's really more to it. So
yeah. Well, I teach best practices of photography, business of photography, at Fullerton College here in Orange County, and we just started our semester 2 weeks ago. And so I've got all of these students in this class who are thinking that they want to build a career for themselves in photography somehow, somewhere, whether it's their own business or what. But, they've all heard the phrase, well, if you take your passion and you make it a business, you suck all the fun out of it. And I haven't found that to be the case at all, Chad. I mean, I always think, if I get to get up and do what I love and get paid for it, I didn't feel like work to me, So, I would encourage anybody that is interested in doing this as a career, whether it's full-time or part-time, just, do that. I mean, just try it and see how it works for you. It's a remarkable feeling to, come home from a day of working with people and creating great images and having enjoyed the day. And, it's a blast.
Yeah. John, you mentioned that you started shooting wet plate kind of in the midst of COVID back in 2020. How did you said that you had heard of wet plate before? I mean, how did your interest in this style of photography really get started?
Yeah, I was familiar with the term. I didn't really know the process, but my dad was sort of a Civil War and an Old West buff, and a lot of books around the house, and there's a lot of old movies and westerns and that sort of thing, and so we kind of had that in common. And I was always fascinated by, particularly, the photography of Brady and Gardner and their teams, the Civil War images, and also Victorian photography was always of interest to me. Just something about it, the style, the aesthetic was always of interest to me. And as I learned more about it, kind of figured out the role that the wet plate process had in some of that anyway. And I really didn't take it much further than that until COVID gave me the opportunity to really kind of focus on it for a bit. Without other distractions, it's like, what else are we going to do?
Yeah.
So, So started, like most people now, start looking at YouTube videos, and there's a lot more now than there was, when I started looking at it, but there was a fair amount. I mean, I think back to, folks like, you know, Joseph Brown and folks that have been around doing this for a long time. And it's like, well, how did you guys learn, without YouTube and all of that? So a lot of resources available to me when I started really looking into it. But picked up Quinn Jacobson's book and the videos that went along with that. And that was my first real introduction to the process, was going through Quinn's material.
Okay, great.
And
Chemical pictures, right?
yeah, chemical pictures. Yeah. And I read it, cover to cover, and I realized, yeah, okay, it's a lot of technical stuff. And I realized later that I kind of glazed over a lot of it, because as I was starting to do the process and I would have questions, and I would reach out to Quinn or, some of the other mentors that I've had in this process. And they'd say, well, do you have Quinn's book? It's on page, whatever. It's like, I know I read that, but it's like without the context of having actually done it, a lot of the stuff in the book didn't make a lot of sense, but
Right.
once you get started doing it, and you go, oh yeah, why does my plate look like this? Or, why is my silver bath doing this, or whatever, then you go back and you look at the book again. Oh, it's right there.
Yeah.
So
And that, and
yeah.
you get so excited after you get that first plate under your belt, you kind of forget about all the technical stuff, right? You just want to jump in
Oh,
and just start
well,
making pictures.
yeah, I've heard some folks on your show here talk about, yeah, my first plate was great or whatever. Mine was terrible. It's like you can hardly tell there's an image there.
Well,
But
let's hear about it.
um,
How did it go for you?
well, it was funny, because I had gone through all of Quinn's material, and I'd continued to research and, gathering all my materials that I needed, and I felt like even with all of that, I was still missing some vital step. There's a technique, a muscle memory sort of thing that you develop, as you know, when you do this for a while. And I felt like, having never poured a plate, I didn't quite know how to do it. I mean, you see it in videos, you read about it, but until you actually do it, you really don't get the sense of how it's done. And so I was kind of struggling. I was kind of frustrated that, gee, I wish there was somebody close to me that was doing that I could just go and watch them do it. And just by happenstance, connected with a photographer who I followed on Instagram, who was doing the process. He was just a little bit ahead of me in having started the process, but we got to chatting, and he said, I have a speed graphic that I've been having trouble with. I'm not really sure about the shutter speeds. This was for, not for wet plate, but for film.
Yeah.
And so we got to chatting, because I've got a number of them. I love, kind of tinkering on old cameras. And I said, well, I have a shutter speed tester. And he said, oh man, if I could come down, he's in LA, if I could come down and you could check out, my shutter speeds on this speed graphic, I'll show you the wet plate process. It's like, oh, when
There
can
we
we
go.
meet? Can you come down now? So Rustin came down, and we spent the afternoon together here at my house and made a few plates. And, like I say, he was a little bit ahead of me in the process. He was still new at it as well. So we had a little trouble trying to figure out why things weren't working, but we got through it, and made a couple of images that you actually tell that, there's people in them. And, but beyond that, they're not great. I still have them. I'll probably have it forever, but, not something that I have out on display for anyone to see.
Yeah. No,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
So, what's your favorite subject using this process? I mean, your portfolio has really got quite an assortment of characters that kind of
Yeah.
seem to show up frequently. I mean,
Yeah.
would you say portraiture is the thing for you with this
Absolutely.
process? Yeah.
Yeah, well, actually, portraiture for any of my photography pursuits is, I've always told my students, is, if I had, one kind of photography, if I could only do one kind of photography, what I call my desert island photography, it would be people pictures. That's just my thing. I mean, I do other things, especially for, my commercial work. There's, architecture, and there's product and drone work and that sort of thing. But, if I could do nothing else, it would be people. And so I'm looking at this wall of 4x5 plates that I have here in front of me, and every single plate is people. Most in the studio, some on location, but most of it's studio, strobe lit. But they're all people, and I remember the conversations we had while they're sitting here in front of my lens. So yeah.
That's great. How hard or maybe how easy was it to convince people to actually sit down and model while you were trying to figure out this process?
Well, I had a couple of built-in models. My adult children, live at home at the moment, and so I kind of called on them, frequently at the beginning of this. Hey, I want to test out this process. I've got a different lens. I've got a different setup. I want to try this light, whatever. And so there are a lot of photos of my daughter, a number of my son as well. And I figured after a point they kind of got tired of me asking. But, I've got a lot of friends who are, in the film industry or actors who just love to bring characters, and that's the fun part about working with actors is they not only bring an interesting face, but they bring a character to the shoot.
Right.
So I've had the privilege of working with a bunch of folks like that, but a lot of them are, students that I've had over the years, just friends who are, when they hear about the process, they go, "Oh, that sounds really cool. I'd like to see how that works." And when I shoot with somebody, and I will probably have to change this when I start doing, pop-up stuff, which is, I've got a couple of things lined up for this year now. I spend a lot of time just talking about the process and educating. That's kind of my nature. And so they get to learn about it. In many cases, get to try it themselves, try their hand at it. And so it's just a fun time. We spend a couple hours together on an afternoon and have a great old time.
That's great. Well, let's hear about your studio. What's kind of the arrangement of your area where you actually shoot at?
Yeah. Well, it's a home studio. My dream one day is to have a studio like, Shane's or like Carrie's or something like that, but I don't know that that's in the cards for me. During COVID, we rearranged my garage. I have a detached garage, and that became my teaching space, my workspace, my studio space. And I generally don't like to bring clients here just because it doesn't feel, professional to me. But this is where my wet plate stuff happens because I'm not going to haul around my big Speedotron packs and all of the other stuff, for the most part, unless it's really, really worthwhile. So they come to me for that. And so it's I don't know, it's about a 8-foot wide space by about 12 feet long and a couple of backdrop rolls. And like I said, I've got I do most of my work with strobes. I much prefer working with strobe versus natural light for this process. And so I've got a couple of Speedotron packs and a number of lights and all of that. And so it's all done right here in the garage. And I use my little portable dark box as my dark room in the garage. So I just leave it set up and work inside of that. So I can work with the door up and all of that.
Yeah. Did you have to do much research on how to set up your dark room? I mean, I guess coming from that film background, you kind of knew.
Yeah, I had a dark room in high school, so I was familiar, and that's why I tell folks who have never experienced the wet plate process, but in many cases have, or a lot of the folks that I talk with have done some wet darkroom printing in the past, and so they're familiar somewhat with the darkroom process, and the wet plate process is not completely dissimilar to the printing, darkroom printing process. So they get it. And so for me, the biggest challenge for me was a dark box. There's so many ways to do those. And I see, some that are, a plastic bin from Home Depot with some holes cut in it. And some of these, elaborate wooden ones that are on wheels and carts and bicycles and all of that. And I thought, well, somewhere in between there is something that I'm going to find, aesthetically pleasing, but also functional for what I need. And so I found an old vintage suitcase on Craigslist or OfferUp or something like that. And my daughter drafted, the drape, the curtain, the whole thing, and made that part for me. And so now it all packs down into a little suitcase and can go with me wherever I go.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah. I have the Ilford pop-up as well. I've only used it once or twice. I don't know. I much prefer my little suitcase setup. It's a little more convenient.
Now for that Ilford tin, I mean, you can actually step inside of that. There's enough headroom to kind of stand up? Or
Yeah. I've used it a couple of times when I've done demos for my students because I can actually have a person, it'll accommodate two people, for the 30 seconds or so that you're in the tent. I think if you're in there any longer with two people, it'd get tight and stuffy real fast. But for the 30 seconds or so that you're in there to develop or to transfer the plate from the silver bath to the the holder, at least they can see you rather than I've done it where I've been under my little suitcase hood and just trying to kind of describe what I'm doing to the people who are outside it. And it's just not quite the same. So it's useful in a teaching context to have that Ilford pop up. But the times that I've taken the show on the road, I've only taken the Ilford tent twice, I think. Every other time it's been the suitcase setup.
Yeah. There's a part of me that's wanted to get one of those ice fishing tents, those quick fish tents, but I've not pulled the trigger on that yet.
No, I saw, because that's what I was looking at first. That's before I knew about the Ilford tent and not wanting to really build something of my own. And I think Barut had a video on that. Is it the Eskimo? Is that the name?
I think so. I think that's the brand,
Yeah, and he showed his, how he had to prepare it. He had to kind of paint over the seams and all this kind of stuff. I thought, boy, I may as well just build one if I've got to do all of that to a manufactured one. So yeah. So, and I don't know how much effort they are to set up or anything, but I tell you that the suitcase thing, it just pops open. I've got a couple of PVC supports, to give shape to the drape, the cloth.
Yep.
So I can stand up, in it, and it comes down to about mid calf. And the one thing I did learn the first time I took it out was that I needed something to weigh down the bottom of the drape, because any little breeze will kind of blow it around. And so I got a couple of things, just clamped to the bottom of it, and it works great. So, and it's quick to set up. So
yeah, I feel pretty good. I finally got my Army footlocker working pretty good.
Mm-hmm.
I installed some new lighting in it here recently.
I saw that. Yeah. I think you had a reel or something on Instagram or something. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
I had been using these kind of cheapy Harbor Freight kind of warning lights, and the batteries just died on them pretty quick. So now I'm electrified, so I'm good to go now.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned that, because that's been probably one of the things that I have changed out more than anything else in this process is my safe lights. I must have, I don't know, 5 or 6 varieties of safe lights in my space here. I mean, I've got my, my headlamp with the red LED. I've got what I use in my little suitcase dark box. I've got it's a LED, bicycle light, like a tail light, rechargeable.
Yep.
I've got some Costco lights. All the it must be 5 or 6 different varieties here, and depending on what I'm doing, I'll use one or more of them at any given time. So but they all work great, and it's it's a lot easier than what I remember of my darkroom back in high school, where we didn't have that kind of stuff. You really had to go with a safe light, and there was no rechargeable portable thing that you could do at that time. So
right. Yeah, it's always good to have backup, though.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, invariably with the rechargeable one, especially because the one I use in my suitcase is the bicycle backup light. And I have a pair of them. Just bought them on Amazon, and invariably the one that's in the darkroom shuts off partway through a session. So I always have the other one charged, so I can swap them out and make sure that I always have something in there.
Right. Well, you mentioned that you're a bit of a collector of old equipment. What was your first camera that you started shooting wet plate with?
First one for wet plate would have been Graflex Speed Graphic.
Okay.
I had, when I got back into film, I kind of got back into it with a vengeance, picking up old medium format cameras. Started off with a Rolleiflex, and I always wanted, my RB67 that I used to shoot with. And so I, kind of repurchased some of those cameras that I had used, previously. And I had never shot large format, and stumbled across a great deal on a Pacemaker Speed Graphic. And I thought, wow, it's relatively easy. It's relatively portable. I mean, as far as 4x5 goes.
Sure.
And then started reading about the Aero Ektar lens, that people were adapting to work on a speed graphic. And I fell in love with that look. The f2.5 Aero Ektar was just a gorgeous look. I mean, that really drew me in. And so I had that set up. I was shooting film and I was shooting paper with the Speed Graphic Aero Ektar combo. And so that was my first setup then when I started doing wet plate. I picked up a couple of the Graflex, 1, 2, 3, 4 film backs. I think that's what they're called. And somebody online had a model for a 3D printable insert for that for 4x5. And so, printed up a couple of inserts and had a couple of backs, and I had everything else pretty much that I needed at that point. So away we went. And now it took a while to gather up the lights and figure out the lighting and all that. But at least, for outdoors, natural light, I was pretty well set.
Yeah, those old speed graphics are just a great starter camera for this process.
Yeah. And the first one that I say the first one because, they're a little bit like potato chips, and once you've got it, you can't have just one. You've got to have, I have a stable of them now, but the nice thing about using it for wet plate is that even if the shutter speeds are not accurate or anything, the shutter speeds, at least for outdoors and even for strobe, the way I shoot, you don't really need the focal plane shutter. So it's, it's the lens cap on and off sort of thing. So
exactly,
even if the shutter's not working great, which they're often not, I mean, they're dried out or they don't move well or they hang up or whatever, you don't really need to worry about it for wet plate.
Exactly. Yeah. As long as, especially if you can track down the film pack adapters, makes it really nice. I found a 2x3 film pack adapter here lately, and I don't even have a camera that size, but I went ahead and bought it just in case.
Got the adapter just in case. Yeah. You get the adapter, and the camera will come eventually.
Exactly.
Yeah. Or you'll build something. I know you've built cameras, as I recall. Yeah. So yeah. But that's turned out. I have a couple of other different film holders from. It was at Chromographics and from Zebra and all of that. But for 4x5, I keep going back to the Graflex film pack holders. I just like the way that works. And part of it, I think, is just that's how I learned, and you just stick with what you know. But, for 5x7 and 8x10, I've got, I think, Zebra holders and with the magnetic catches and all of that stuff. So,
well, you are a bit of an experimenter when it comes to wet plate as far as the equipment itself. Do you have any custom built equipment that gets regular use?
Custom built? No, not really. I mean, as far as cameras and things like that, no, I don't think I really have anything that's custom. I mean, I've tried making my own plate holders, 3D printing my own plate holders.
Okay. Yep.
And by the time it was done, it's like, I would be better off just buying one that I know actually works. So, but I'm trying to think. I don't really have much stuff. I mean, other than the dark box itself, which was custom. Nothing that I've really built or built from scratch or designed. Yeah,
I've got a bunch of those inserts you mentioned. To go from 8x10 to 5x7 or something like that I printed out. But I really need to go back and like reprint all of those. I just recently really got my 3D printer dialed in for like dimensional accuracy, and I need to go back because I've got some play in a lot of those.
Yeah, I did the same thing, Chad, and then I found, I think it was from Lund Photographic, that had an 8x10 to 5x7 and 8x10 to 4x5, reducing adapters. And after having seen those and looking at my kind of substandard 3D printed plastic ones, I was like, why would I bother? So I ended up buying them and they're wonderfully made. They're just super clean and easy to use and easy to get the plates in and out of. And that was what I ended up with. Or one of those times when I want to, break out the 8x10 and have the option to do some other sizes as well.
So what kind of gear are you using these days for most of your portraiture?
Yeah, well, for the stuff that I do here in my little home studio space, I have my Toyo monorail camera. It's a 45 G2 monorail set up here in the garage, and I just have it on a studio stand. As much as I would love to do everything sort of period appropriate, I'm a little more about convenience and ease of use sometimes than period appropriate. So that works for me really well here in the studio. It's a bit cumbersome to take out. So when I go out, I usually take the speed graphic if I'm going to do 4x5. I have a Birkin James 5x7 and a Birkin James 8x10 if I want to take them out, for bigger stuff. I tend not to do much other than 4x5 though, honestly, as much as I would love to. I don't have a place to keep the plates, because I do like to keep them if I can. But I just don't, I tend not to do the bigger plates.
Yeah. What about your lens collection?
Yeah, again, more about ease of use than period appropriate. The Aero Ektar is probably the most vintage lens that I shoot with. Everything else is, pretty contemporary. Some Nikkor lenses, some Rodenstock lenses. My go-to that's on the Toyo in the studio here is a 210 millimeter f5.6 Sinar, I think it is, and it does the job. So if I want that nice swirly bokeh, I'll break out the pacemaker with the speed graphic rather with the Aero Ektar. But everything else is pretty much contemporary glass.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had been using the the Indostar, those Russian kind of
Yeah.
large format lenses for a while, and I just picked up two Carl Zeiss Tessars. I've got a 300 and a 250 millimeter, both 4.5. So I'm trying to move those into the rotation. I just printed up some lens boards for those for my Cambo. So
Yeah. And it's funny you mentioned lens boards. That's the thing that I probably print the most, with regard to cameras, because pick up a lens or pick up a camera rather that doesn't have a lens board, or I need to use this lens on this camera and I don't have a board for it. So rather than buy them off of eBay, that's one thing that I can print pretty reliably. The one thing I did experiment, since you mentioned the Industar, for a while I was experimenting with some of the Boole projection lenses.
okay,
The fixed apertures like f2.5. Not a variable aperture. I was using that for a short time and found that I really wanted to have aperture control. I'd gone to the point of printing out some Waterhouse stops, that you could just kind of put on the front of the lens, to knock down the aperture a little bit. But I found that they were not convenient for doing this sort of thing. So they're sitting in a cabinet right now, gathering dust. So.
Yeah, lens boards and lens caps. I print a lot of those too.
Oh yeah. And the sad thing is that I end up printing with lens caps in particular. I end up printing probably 2 or 3 to get one that fits right, because I measure it all out and I go, I need to add just this much to it. And so what I end up doing is I print it a little oversized and then gaff tape to the rescue to kind of size it just right, so it doesn't stick when you try to take it off, but it doesn't fall off. So I'd love to have one of is it Andre who makes the leather lens caps?
I think so. Yep.
Yeah. I would love to have some of those. They're just so pretty, and I'm sure they're great. So.
Yeah, I just recently picked up a set of calipers, so I can get really dialed in now, and I did print off some lens caps here recently. Once I finally got my printer all dialed in and calibrated, and now they're coming out really good. So
yeah. Well, what software do you use to do your 3D design for printing?
I use Fusion 360.
See, I need to learn that. I can't draw to save my life, which is probably why I'm a photographer. But I struggle with the CAD. My dad was a mechanical engineer, so you'd think maybe some of those genes would have been passed on. But so I dabble in Tinkercad. It's pretty basic shapes and all that, and it does the trick for most of the stuff, but I don't think it's anywhere near as precise or flexible as Fusion 360. So one of these days I'm going to have to learn how to use that.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. I mean, it's really good for this kind of stuff. And I tried to play around with Blender for a while, and it just seems like it just does not have that dimensionality to it. Everything's not constrained based on the dimensions. So I really like that piece of Fusion 360.
Yeah. One of these days, I'm sure there are online courses on Fusion 360. I'm going to so maybe we won't hope for another lockdown, but that'd be a good opportunity to learn Fusion 360 when I've got nothing else to do. Right.
That is exactly what I did. That's when I learned it, was during the COVID piece, and just watched a bunch of YouTube videos. So
yeah. So that's good stuff.
Okay, so John, if you had the chance to photograph anyone today, who would it be?
I think there are a lot of people I'd like to photograph. The people that I regret not having photographed when I had the opportunity was my dad, in particular. My dad passed away in the middle of 2022. He and Mom would come out, to visit periodically, but they hadn't done that in a long time. They had been out just before the COVID lockdown happened. So they had just gone back to Indiana just before that. And of course, that was before I was doing the wet plate process. And, they were excited about what I was doing. They loved the images, as I got, further along in the process, and it just didn't work out for them to come back out to visit. So I regret not having been able to do, Dad's portrait that way. And Mom is still living, but, won't be coming to California. So they'll probably never have an opportunity to do her portrait that way. But as far as other people that I would like to photograph, I would love to meet Gary Sinise and photograph him as part of this process. I'd love to photograph some of the veterans, particularly some of the World War II vets who are fewer and further between now that I've photographed in my Faces of Freedom project over the years. But because of Gary's involvement with the veterans and his support of the veterans, I'd love to get him involved with that, and I would love to photograph him in this process as well.
That's fantastic. I was going to ask you, so tell some of the folks about your Faces of Freedom project.
You can see it on the website, or at least some of the selected images from it. There's a portfolio gallery for the Faces of Freedom project, but it's a simple, just a thank you for your service thing. Started off, I don't know, it's probably maybe 15 years ago now, doing portraits of the vets at my church for, honoring them on Veterans Day that Sunday morning. And so I had a setup. I'd kind of been inspired by Platon's style, his lighting and, simple backdrop and that sort of thing. So not that these look like Platon's work by any means, but that was kind of the inspiration for the look. And, it kind of mushroomed from there. I created these portraits, and, there's no cost to the veterans or anybody for doing this. And then as it turned out, I would get a request from, a group that would say, hey, we're having a gathering or some sort of event. We're going to have a bunch of veterans here. Can you come and do, the same kind of thing for them? And it's just taken off. And so now, it's a couple times a year. There's a few big events. There's one really beautiful event here in Orange County over the week of Veterans Day. It's the Community Foundation of Orange puts on their Field of Valor, and they do 1,776 3x5 American flags in this field, and it's just, Chad, it's just stunning to walk through and just appreciate and understand the sacrifices that were made, as you walk through this field. So I'll set up there on opening day, and we may photograph, between 50 and 100 veterans that day, and then I just provide a printable version of the image for them to download and do what they want with it. I've had a lot of families come back to me over the years and, hey, my dad passed away or grandpa passed away, and I just remember that portrait that you did, a couple of years ago. Do you still have that? We'd like to print it up for the family or for the memorial service or something like that. So I'm happy to be able to do it. I'm happy that it provides something for the families. And a lot of these folks have never had, a professional portrait done. So just happy to be able to do it for them.
Yeah, that's a great service to be able to provide to these folks. Have you ever given any thought to shooting wet plates with, kind of this dwindling group of heroes?
Yes, I have. And in fact, that's what I've been thinking in terms of, I would like to reach back out to some of these folks, especially the older ones. I mean, at this last Field of Valor event in 23, I had a World War II vet. I think he was 102 years old, if I remember right. My concern is, are they going to be able to get here? This is part of the issue.
Yeah.
And would they be able to tolerate sitting for the process? Because, it's not like, click, 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 and, thank you, and, your images will be in the mail or whatever. They have to sit for a bit, and I'm not sure how well they'd tolerate it. I'd love to try it. And I've tried taking the 4x5 camera to do film at these events, and it just timing wise, it doesn't play out very well. So
yeah.
So it's been almost all digital, and that seems to work pretty well.
Yeah, it definitely cuts down on the amount of folks that you can kind of run through the process.
Yes. Yeah. And as much as I hate to say it's, those events are an assembly line sort of style of photography, it really is. I mean, I have a few kind of basic poses that I do. I'll do, 5 or 6 frames of each person to try and get, the best expression, the best look. A lot of them can't hear me when I'm talking to them, so, trying to get their attention and all this sort of thing, and pick the best, from that. So to try and do a process that, takes 10 minutes to create, one image probably wouldn't work very well in that context. But I'd love to do it, in some other venue somehow.
Yeah.
Have them come to me or whatever. I don't know how it would work exactly, but I'd love to try something like that.
Well, if you get your pop-up set up good to go, my wife and I went to the local VFW post a few years back, and we shot about, three or four different veterans, and I think maybe you and I chatted about this. I mean, the best part about it for me was just talking to them and hearing their stories. So
yeah, and that's the thing that I think appeals to me maybe more than anything else. I mean, I do love the aesthetic of wet plate. I love the end result, but unlike my digital work, and for that matter, even unlike the large format film and paper stuff that I shoot, there's downtime in the wet plate process where your plate is sensitizing or you're developing or it's fixing or whatever. There's minutes here and there where you get to chat, and you get to find out about people and hear their stories. And that's the interesting part to me. I think more than anything else is just getting to know a little bit more about people in those times.
Yeah. Are there any other ideas that you've got for maybe a series you've not shot yet, or maybe you're looking into?
Yeah. Well, I've started still trying to kind of round up victims, but willing subjects to flesh out my musicians in wet plate series. I have a few, some guitar players, some horn players, I have a bassoon player, banjo player. Just today heard back from a gal I reached out to that I met at the Renaissance Fair here in Southern California last year. She's a hurdy-gurdy player. So we're chatting about, next time she's down here in May, to try and get her into the studio to photograph her.
Hurdy-gurdy. So I think I saw this request. You were looking for a theremin player and a hurdy-gurdy.
Theremin and a hurdy-gurdy.
And I know what a theremin is, but I don't know what a hurdy-gurdy is.
Oh, well, you'll have to look at it. I didn't know what it was, but I'd heard it. It was the opening music for, I don't know, some HBO series or something, I think. And I thought, what in the world is that sound? And then learned, eventually it's a hurdy-gurdy, but it's a medieval instrument, stringed instrument. And it has a rotating, I don't know if it's a drum or something like that kind of constantly vibrates the strings. And then there's a series of keys that you press, for fretting, essentially, for the melody. So it's kind of winding motion, rotating this handle on the end of the instrument, the tail pin end, and playing with keys on this stringed instrument. It's a really interesting sound. But I've always had an interest in history, and in particular, medieval European history. And so this kind of goes back to I guess some of that interest. But part of it to me also is, especially like with a theremin, the juxtaposition of the old style of photography and a modern electronic instrument I think is interesting to me. So that'll be a fun one if I can find somebody who can bring their theremin to my space.
That's great. Yeah, I've seen some of your spirit photography work in the past too. What's your process for creating those types of images using the wet plate process?
Yeah, well, that was the first time I had tried this. I had seen it. I know, Shane has done it in the past. I was inspired by some of his work, but the drama troupe, the Masker Theater Company that I've been involved with for many years, did their A Christmas Carol as their production at the end of last year. And I've always done the promotional photography for their shows. And when I heard from Ian, the director, that they were doing Christmas Carol, and of course it's Victorian, and I thought, Victorian and wet plate, and I said to Ian, would you be interested in doing, and of course he said yes before I even, finished the sentence. He said, whatever you want to do, John, just whatever you want to do is fine.
Yeah.
And so I thought, period appropriate, to the show. And, the themes, of course, with the ghost of Christmas, past and future and present and all of this sort of thing. I thought, well, ghosts and Victorian and spirit photography, wet plate, it just all kind of, came to me that I had to try this. The process was pretty simple. We set up, it was an outdoor shoot, so it was one of the few times that I didn't shoot with strobe, and basically had, Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge, standing in place, and then I would have the ghosts in place for about the first half of the exposure, 3-4 seconds or so, and then I would have them just walk out of frame. And so, I don't know, it was about a 6 or 8 second exposure, I think, is what we ended up with. But they would be there for about half the exposure, and then the ghost would walk away. And I was really pleased with the way it worked out. I wasn't sure it was going to work. I'd never tried it before. It was like, oh, this is live TV, folks. Hopefully it turns out the way I'm anticipating.
Exactly.
And I was pretty happy with it. Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, you kind of know the principle of it, but actually doing it is a whole
yes,
different
exactly.
thing.
Till you try it. Right. Yeah. Well, I have an opportunity here. I mentioned we could be doing some pop-ups this year. I've had a relationship with a museum. It's actually just down the street from where I live here. The Heritage Museum of Orange County, and they have on their property these two beautiful Victorian homes that have moved there over the years from other locations. And I met with their event coordinator recently, and he's very excited about having me come and do wet plates at some of their events. They're going to be bringing Civil War days back in the summer. They have a dinosaurs to people event. They have an Old West Day. They have a Native American Heritage Day. There's a couple of different things where we're going to go and set up and offer to do plates for folks. But this week, Friday, I'm meeting with Ebenezer Scrooge again over at the museum, where we have this beautiful Victorian home that we're going to use as a backdrop this time, and just to create some what I hope to be really interesting, Victorian portraits, Victorian style, Victorian setting, that sort of thing. But I'm working with a filmmaker friend of mine who's doing a documentary on this wet plate journey of mine. And so we're trying to film some location shoots. And so we're going to do some BTS type of stuff and while we're doing this shoot. And so it'll be a lot of fun. I'm hoping that it's not just a swampy mess over there after all the rain we've had this week.
I was going to say, hopefully you get some good weather this week.
Yeah, well, it's supposed to be stopping about now, and it's supposed to start clearing up. So I'm hoping by Friday it will be, dry enough where we're going to be working that we won't be, stepping in puddles. So,
yeah,
but it should be a lot of fun.
Well, with all of the background that you've got in photography, what is it about collodion in today's world that motivates you to keep using this process?
Yeah. It's going to sound cliche. I'm sure everybody says the same thing, but, and it's not just collodion, but I think it's moving back into analog photography to a degree, is that I find myself being much more intentional in my photography with a process that you can't do it in a spray and pray fashion, like you can with digital. I'm always reminded of Peter Hurley's quote, talking about headshots. He says, and don't take the same picture twice. It's hard to do that with the wet plate process. It's slow, it's meticulous, it's challenging at times. One of the things I love about, being a working photographer is troubleshooting. It's trying to figure out how to make something work given whatever circumstances I'm presented with. And we all know the vagaries of the wet plate process. Today it's your developer, tomorrow it's the temperature, whatever it happens to be. It's, why isn't it working today for some reason? Worked perfectly an hour ago, So I enjoy that aspect of it. I'm not a chemist. I don't appreciate the nuances of the chemistry like some folks do. I have folks that I call on. Dale Wilson, for example, is just phenomenal when it comes to understanding the chemistry. So when I have questions about that stuff, I know that Dale's just a direct message away, and he's always happy to chat. So he's been a great help in that process. But for me, I think it's the slowing down, it's the deliberation, the intentionality, and the fact that it takes more time, and I get to talk to my sitters, in more depth than probably any other kind of process that I do.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, and I love the smell. You can't argue with the smell of ether in the morning, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Well, one of the things that I love about this podcast is trying to track down as much information about my guests without having actually spoken to them before. And one of the interesting things that I found about you, I'd like to hear about. So my wife and I have been watching this show called For All Mankind here recently,
Yes.
which is kind of like
Yeah.
an alternative view of,
Yeah.
the Apollo. You had
Right.
the chance to actually hold and photograph film that had been on
Yes.
the moon.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's
yeah.
hear
that
about
was that was an experience. So a friend of mine, it was a friend of a friend of a friend kind of thing. But the gentleman that had the film was a NASA engineer, retired engineer, and he was also a car guy. And so I met him through the car photography stuff that we used to do. And he found in his desk this roll of film from one of the NASA missions. I'd have to go back and remember which one it was now. I had done a blog post about it. I can't remember which mission it was now. But it was actual slide film from the Hasselblads that they, took to the moon. And he wanted to make a book out of it and didn't have a way to print these, 2.25 slides. It was roll film, it wasn't cut, but color slides. And at that time I had just kind of gotten back into my film photography, and I was using a Nikon D810, DSLR to digitize my negatives. And when he found out about this, I said, well, could you do that for these? Can you reproduce these for me? And it's like, yes, can I touch them? But I tell you, I've never been more nervous about handling film than that roll.
I can't imagine.
It was like, wow, this is history in my hands here. So, but it was cool. I never did see the book that he did from it, but I hated to give it back, but had to go back.
That's a pretty cool experience.
Yeah, that was fun. That was an interesting time.
So you mentioned some of the folks kind of early on that helped you. Who are some of those resources that you kind of reached out to that helped you along in the early days of trying to figure out the process?
Yeah. Oh gosh. I mean, there've been so many. That's one of the things I've really come to appreciate about this wet plate community. And I know there's discussion about how many people are really doing wet plate now and all this kind of thing, and who really knows. But the thing that I love about it is that the people who are doing it are always willing to help new people or people who who've been doing it for a long time and just have questions. It's a community. It's a family.
Yeah.
And I don't see that with so many other things like this. And so I've really come to appreciate that. But there are a few people that really stand out to me who have been, sort of my mentors along the way. I mentioned Dale Wilson in Canada. He's been a great resource for me. Spoke with Mark Osterman through direct message a number of times. He's been a great help. Of course, Shane, how can you talk about wet plate without mentioning Shane Balkowicz in the same breath? Shane is such an amazing resource for everybody who's in this process, does beautiful work, and always willing to lend a hand or offer a suggestion. There's Conrad Young, lives 45 minutes from me. He and Chris Morgan have been really helpful in helping me with some work through some workflow issues as I'm starting to do this pop-up thing this year. So they've been great with that. Joseph Brown, reached out to him a couple times with questions. He's been very helpful. Carrie, always helpful. But these folks are not just, mentors, but they're amazing artists. And I think that's, for me, that's almost as valuable as just having them as mentors, is just having them as inspiration. They just do amazing work. So yeah, I feel fortunate that they'll even talk to me, sometimes.
You had mentioned that there were quite a few other wet platers in your area. Have you guys thought about trying to get together sometime? I got names when we stopped by Bodie a couple of years ago, and then I think we communicated once or twice via social media, after that, and then just kind of lost track of it. I think that was pre-COVID and during COVID and all that, so nothing really ever happened with it. But yeah, I would like to. It would be great to start a list. In fact, I think you mentioned in one of your podcasts that somewhere there was it a Google form or something like that of folks who are doing wet plate, kind of a directory. Yeah, I think
which I think would be amazing to have access to something like that.
Yeah, I think Quinn Jacobson had put together a a Google map of some sort that you could actually go in and put your name and where you were located.
Yeah.
But I got the impression that it probably hadn't been updated for some time, and I don't know how many people were using it. I did try and get into that at some point, so I know it's working. But we can post the link up for that. I think I actually posted on my website for the 10 Questions podcast. There's a link for it there. So if folks are hearing this, hopefully you can click the link. You can get to that from the Instagram for 10 Questions off a link tree, and then it should show up there.
Yeah. I think that would be phenomenal to have just an opportunity to meet up with folks in the area. I know, the folks are talking all the time about, I'm traveling through such and such a town, are there any, wet plate artists here? And, there are a few studios that I know of, but they're probably places that I, won't likely get to in my lifetime. I'd love to get to, but, so I know there are others around here in Southern California. I'd love to connect.
Yeah. It's so funny talking to the different folks in the community that there are so many common threads that we all share, common interests and things like that. And I always love getting together with folks to talk about the process and just see what they're doing.
Well, and the funny thing is that it doesn't matter how long you've been doing it. You watch somebody else do it, or you do it with someone else, and you learn something new every time. I mean, somebody does something a little bit different. It's like, I should try that. I mean, just in talking with, was it Conrad and it was either Conrad or Chris Morgan about this, sort of pop-up workflow. And, one of the things that I had questions about was being able to deliver a plate to somebody they could walk away with, because for me in my setup, I'll shoot, they'll see the plates, I'll scan them usually the same day after I set them on a rack to dry, just air dry. And I'll scan them usually later that evening and send them the digital files. But the original plates, I let them sit for a week or so usually before I varnish. But I can't do that in a pop-up situation. So just even little things like making a drying rack that will go in my toaster oven, where the plates can stand on edge. It's like, I never thought of that. It's the little things, the little tips and tricks like that you pick up when you talk to somebody else who does this that, make the process better.
Yeah,
so,
for sure.
Yeah.
I know. I feel pretty good if I can take one picture every, 15 minutes or so in my studio.
Yeah.
But we did a wedding reception here a few months back, and we were shooting plates every 6 minutes or so. So I mean, we were really trying to crank them out. But I know folks like Chris Morgan. I mean, they're even twice that. So
well, and I think about I remember your interview with Sarah Coulter. Her work is just stunning. I would love to have lunch with her someday. That would just be fantastic. So Sarah, if you're listening to this, you can find me on Instagram. I'd love to meet you someday. But just the crew that she had, I mean, it's the cream of the crop making that process work. I don't know how many plates they did for Yellowstone in 1883, but just a phenomenal number of plates. I can't imagine doing that without, having half a dozen people running the process. I just can't imagine doing it, one person.
I mean, that she put together a team of some pretty heavy hitters. I mean, to do all that. So
yeah.
They were really cranking out some really quality work there.
Yeah. Well, I had an opportunity to do my very first outing on location for a wet plate was for a filmmaker friend of mine, Matt Hall, who I'd done a lot of set photography and key art for him on other projects for him, and he called me up one day and he had this idea for a new project. It was a sci-fi Western. And before he even got the words out of his mouth, I said, would you be interested in wet plate portraits of the cast? It's like, hey, and he said, John, anything you want to do. Happy to have you do whatever you want to do. So I hauled my kit up to a little town called Landers, which is near Joshua Tree National Park in the high desert, and learned a few things about doing wet plate out in the open, breeze, dust, that kind of stuff. It made some really, really cool portraits that day. That I was very, very happy with. So
yeah, it's great. Hey, let's talk about being a teacher. You mentioned that you teach photography at maybe some of the local colleges there. Do you get to share this process with your students?
Yes. In fact, I've done demonstrations on campus. We have also done demonstrations off campus where students are free to, come. Anybody that's interested, free to come and see the process. And if they want to, they can try it. It's the see one, do one, teach one kind of idea. I do have one student or former student of mine who I knew from the outset that this was going to be her thing. She just has that vibe that she exudes. It's analog this and I mean they raise bees, they make their own honey, I think they probably make their own fabric for clothes and all this kind of stuff. It's just that's her thing. It's kind of the prairie woman kind of vibe. But she has gotten the wet plate bug, and I was able to kind of walk her through the process, and she's now got all of her stuff. She got her chemistry from Brian, and she's, got almost all of her equipment. She's got I think a Crown graphic that she's shooting with. And so she's ready to make her first plates on her own now. And I'm excited to see where she takes it. So it's kind of neat, even though I haven't been doing it for that long myself, to kind of be able to pass that on and, to the next generation. It's been kind of fun.
Yeah. Well, as somewhat of a newcomer to the process, what advice would you give to somebody that's thinking about getting into this?
Yeah. Well, it's the same advice that they will get if they go on any of the forums, and it's do a workshop if you can. I wish I had, honestly, because there are things that, as much as I, got out of reading Quinn's book on my own, had I done an in-person workshop, I think it would have saved me a lot of time in getting to where I am, especially at the beginning. I can't count the number of silver tanks that I bought before I finally found something that I liked. But if I'd seen what somebody else was doing and knowing what the pros and cons of different types of equipment, what you need, what you don't need, what's nice to have, that kind of thing, I probably would have saved myself a lot of money in that process. So even though the workshops are, can be expensive, I think in the long run, spending that money on a workshop and really making sure that it's something that you want to invest in, but then knowing how to purchase wisely, for the stuff that you need, would have been a big help for me. So I don't regret it, but at the same time, I kind of wish I had started there. But by all means, do it. It's a fascinating process. There's nothing more rewarding than watching that plate come up in the fixer. That never gets old. Just every time. I love that. My clients are going ooh and on. I'm going, man, I just love this. So
that's fantastic. Well, Jon, thanks for being on the show today. What is the best way for people to either reach out to you, maybe see your work, maybe get an image taken by you? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, probably the best way to contact me is through my website. I'm on social, but I don't often see the messages that come through social right away. But stuff that comes through my website contact page comes right to me. So it's JonHaverstickStudio.com. It's Jon, so no H, JonHaverstickStudio.com. And there's examples of my work there, and folks can reach out for conversation about how they can do the same thing.
That's great. Yeah, and I would encourage folks to check out your work if they've not seen it yet. And also, I would challenge everybody to go out and take a picture of a veteran using this process if you ever get the chance.
Yeah, that's on my list, Chad. I've got the contacts. I just need to make it happen now. So
okay.
Yeah. So, well, I appreciate the opportunity to chat with you. And like I say, we've done this, a few times over social, and it's nice to actually to have a conversation rather than just type it all out. So,
yeah, it's fantastic. Thanks, Jon.
Yeah. I appreciate it. Thanks, Chad. Have a good night.
I hope you've enjoyed this week's episode and maybe even picked up some insights that will help you along in your own wet plate journey. I'd love to hear from you on who you'd like to have on in a future episode. So send me a message and follow our Instagram account at 10 questions with any feedback. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast provider. Thanks for listening to me, Chad Shryock, and my expert guests, and I look forward to you joining me again in the coming weeks for a new episode of 10 Questions.